Welcome to another episode of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is David Burkus. I'll tell you about David in a minute. Those of you who know the show know that grace for me is the generosity we show, respect we give, and compassion we demonstrate. And when you do it as a leader, especially now during challenging times, it requires the ability to act for others and energize everyone. It is a pleasure to interview David. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Although I'll confess, I wish I was on whatever beach that little video was filmed on.
I think we're all like that right now. I want to tell the folks about you, David. You are one of the world's leading business thinkers. You are forward thinking, and I say that with respect. You're a best-selling author, and you talk about innovation, collaboration, and how to pick a fight. And we'll talk about that in a moment. You are an in-depth researcher, which gives you the heft and the credibility. Your books have been translated into a dozen languages. Your TED Talk has been viewed over 2 million times. Boy, am I jealous. But you got the street. You have the organizational street cred in my book because you do the research. So your writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, HBR, Harvard Business Review, USA, Fast Company, and many, many more. And you've been on NPR, BBC, and CBS Morning Show. You're also a Thinkers 50 person, and like me, a member of Marshall Goldsmith 100 Coaches. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. No, I love that you put the MG 100 in there because that's my favorite club to be a part of.
Well, we're all fortunate, I think, to be part of that. So, David, I want to put you teach. You're a professor. What's it like on campus right now?
Yeah, it's interesting, to say the least. So I was actually teaching last semester, and I only teach one class. I'm I guess lucky in that regard in a semester, and we flipped to fully virtual. And so I had what is normally spring break to rework and make an autonomous driven online course, et cetera. That was really, really interesting. What's unique now is we're on campus, students are wearing masks, everybody's in a double large, like whatever the capacity for your old classroom was, now you have double the capacity so you can social distance. But the weirdest thing is taking into account that every class is simultaneously in the classroom and virtual, right? So the level of technology to sort of be aware of, I mean, it feels like you're lecturing to a room full of people and then also doing this, right? So that's actually been really interesting. Now, what's fun about that is, at least I've noticed, it's a whole lot easier to keep students engaged, not moment to moment, but week to week, because even the ones that are absent, there's no catch up, right? There's just this expectation that you will catch up on your own. So I'm really enjoying that part. The masks make it really hard to crack a joke, right? Because you can't see the little smiles and that sort of stuff. You can kind of see it in the eyes, but not really. And I'm that type of professor that gets into a long discussion about leader-member exchange theory and then cracks a random joke. And I like to see that feedback, and I'm not seeing it now. So that's been my personal hardest struggle.
Oh, that's good. So I'm going to guess the students, how are they adapting to this from what you see, David?
Yeah, I mean, college students always think that they're invincible. Of course, one of the things we're learning is that in regards to this, a lot of them are. So that's a relief, right? Because they would have acted that way anyway. But I think the other thing is I've actually been impressed. So in prior years, I mean, I teach in the School of Business, and every year there's a team with a social loafer, right? A slacker who doesn't do a lot, and the students come to me to fire that person. And then I have to explain to them that, in real life, you're going to be on a team with a slacker, so you need to figure it out, et cetera. It's actually been easier for them to engage in that, and easier for them to, even if one person is out or in quarantine, which has happened, a student tests positive and then has to be in their dorm room alone for 14 days. Because of the fact that all of these classes have moved to technology, it's become easier to keep all of those students engaged, and this is really key, and like track the slackers, right? There is a written record of everybody's conversation. And so I'm actually kind of enjoying that. It gives me hope for, I've staked a lot of where we're headed future of work on this idea that we're going to be hybrid. The way my classroom is currently hybrid, the workplace is going to be hybrid moving forward. And so I'm trying to look for those positives. Accountability and clear expectations is definitely going to be one of them. Socialization and reducing feelings of loneliness is happening on campus, and I think that's going to happen in the future of work environment as well. So it's been a really interesting sort of preview of what happens when we all go back to the office, because we're not all going to go back to the office, at least not all at once.
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. And you use the term hybrid, and you and I have talked about this. And you have a new book about remote teams, do you not?
Yeah. So
So
we actually had this debate around terminology, right? Because there's a million different ways you can describe it. Remote, distributed, virtual, etc. And I actually settled on the terms working from anywhere and leading from anywhere. Leading from anywhere is the name of the new book, because that's the idea. It's not that you're not working, etc. It's just that you're now doing it from everywhere. Not even working from home, right? There are going to be people who work from home, but actually have a membership to a co-working space that's closer to the office, and they spend 2 or 3 days there, et cetera. So, I think that's where we're headed, is to a new level of flexibility in people's work arrangements. And every team is going to sort of simultaneously be co-located or virtual/remote, et cetera. So I threw up my hands and just said, let's just call it from anywhere, because that's what we're actually
I beat you up by using the term remote, because remote, I mean, we understand location-wise, but to me, remote connotes disengagement, whereas virtual, it's a softer term. But I like leading from anywhere or working from anywhere. Let's drill down here. I'm going to put you on the spot. So what do you think, because you're a scholar, you're a researcher, and research can be probably ongoing now. What do you think will be the effect on, well, let's say, promotion and getting noticed if you're working virtually?
Yeah. So let me preface that by saying it depends on whether or not your company and your managers have the appropriate mindset shift, right? I mean, you and I both have been advocating for a mindset shift from presence equals productivity to, actually meeting objectives and focusing on outcome instead of activity. The interesting thing about a remote, virtual, from anywhere work environment is it's even easier to fake presence now, right? You just need to be responsive on Slack or via email. You just need to, be the one who sets your virtual Zoom background to be a video of you nodding on a loop, and then everybody thinks you're working. Like it's actually easier to fake that. So a lot of organizations that sort of fell into this idea that the person who's most readily available and most responsive is the most productive might find themselves promoting people who aren't actually meeting objectives. And there's a lot of before COVID research around those people who fake it aren't actually any more productive when you hold them to objectives. Now, if we flip that mindset, I think this is actually a really good thing. I think we're going to see a decrease in equating things like charisma and confidence to leadership potential, right? Which is my friend Tomas Jamar Pramusic has a great book on that. Why do so many incompetent men become leaders?
Yes.
So I think we're going to see that, because if we do actually make the mindset shift and focus on outcomes, then it'll be the people who are actually meeting outcomes. Now, the challenge here is that just because you're a great individual contributor doesn't mean you're a great manager. So we have to fill that piece as well. But we've already sort of realized that we've already got things in play there. You and I both spend a lot of our time there developing those new leaders. So I'm more confident on that. The big thing I'm still hesitant about saying is that mindset shift between presence, or now responsiveness, and productivity. And if we can finally separate those two things, then we'll be promoting the people that are really creating value, and that gets me really optimistic.
Throughout your work, there's always a streak of contrariness, which is actually very healthy, because you're challenging status quo. And I've always equated presence, and I look at it in the broad sense of being in the moment with your people and being available and all of that. And it's also your earned authority. But in this particular instance, virtual presence can be a hide for being nothing more than a slacker.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, no. I mean, how many of us have had a day, at least since the pandemic, right? How many of us have had a day where we felt really productive all day, and then we found out when we look back, all we actually did was get to inbox zero, right? We didn't actually create any value, but we did a great job responding, right? And that's what I mean. When I say presence, I don't mean this sort of executive presence or any of that sort of stuff. I just mean focusing a little too much on the reactive work and not enough on the deep work that actually creates value.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I'm going to push you again on this. Do you think the virtual or the remote work environment encourages or discourages deep work as you define it? Is it easier or harder? Do you have a thought on it?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So the research around there's one study I'm thinking of in particular around what they call digital nomads, meaning these people that have that dream life where they work remotely and they travel the world and settle in a place and then work from the beaches of Thailand for a couple months and then move somewhere else. And what they found was that consistently the thing they struggled with, it took several weeks, sometimes months, for them to develop a rhythm, a pattern of when they're actually going to work and when they're going to explore this new city, et cetera. And what's funny is if you look at the time breakdown in our giant forced work from home, work from anywhere experiment that as a globe we all just went through, we saw about the same thing, right? So here in the United States where we are, March 15th seems like it was the date, right? There's some states before, some states after, but March 15th. And for the next 2 weeks or so, the people that were still around and engaged were kind of struggling to figure out tech, and then actually really productive for about 2 or 3 more weeks. And people were starting to go, oh, this remote work thing, it's working really well. We're all making it work. And then in the summer, everybody got really burnt out, which is also what you find, right? You find that often people who get to work flexibly or work remotely overcompensate for that generosity by working harder and then don't create the boundaries in their life that give them time away from work. And so they end up burning out, right? So the really long answer to your question, but I think it makes it harder. It makes it easier to be productive, but harder to pull back from work, which has long-term consequences. And the leaders that are really going to thrive in that environment are the ones that help their people build boundaries that we used to use things like a commute for, boundaries between work and life to let people pull away from work as well.
Right. Our friend, colleague, Morag Barrett, was a road warrior and up until COVID, and she lives in a place in Colorado where she has her morning commute, which is in her neighborhood. It's a third of a mile, so she gets up or whenever she's ready, goes a third of a mile, then to the office, then at lunchtime. Third of a mile, and in the afternoon she does this too. So it's her own kind of commute, and it's a way of her anchoring, and it's an interesting concept. So.
Oh yeah, no, I love that. I mean, I've been blessed to. We live in a part of the world that doesn't normally have basements because of water tables and that sort of stuff, but we have one, and my commute is now 11 steps down into the basement, where I can hide from the rest of my family, right? So that's been my own commute, and it's been a great kind of physical boundary. I could go upstairs whenever I want, but sure. Climbing back up those stairs, that's just the right amount of friction and stress on my quads, I guess, that keep me from doing it too often.
Okay, now I want to, because I teased this concept, tell us about your audiobook, Pick a Fight. What a great title. I'm not sure what I know about it, but it's good. Talk about contrarian. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So, we've known about, and you and I have both written copious words about, and so has the entire industry, about the role of purpose and motivation, the connection between that, how purpose gets teams bonded together, gets people more motivated. But the needle in engagement hasn't really moved, right? Like to use the Gallup Q12, which is, I have various different opinions on it, but one of the core questions of that is whether or not I feel like my job is a part of the company's mission and purpose, right? And yet engagement numbers haven't really moved, which tells me that we are all aware of the role of purpose, but we're all failing, in my view, to make the connection between what is that senior level mission statement that we crafted and how do people see that in their day-to-day lives. That's the sort of big challenge. And so what I came up with was my litmus test for whether or not we're doing that appropriately is, can people give a clear and concise answer to the question, what are we fighting for? Not who are we fighting? That's a question about competitors. I'm actually not interested in that.
Yeah.
I'm interested in, do we see the purpose of this organization as a fight for justice, as a fight to make the world better, as a fight to remove an evil in the world that needs to be removed? If we can do that, if we can frame it that way, then we give people a clear and compelling answer to that question. And we make it much more likely that teams get bonded together and much more likely that people see how their role helps that fight.
By it's interesting. I love the way you frame purpose as in, what are we fighting for? Because in a way, purpose can be, I've written a whole book about it, and actually in chapters of other books reference it to it. And sometimes even I struggle exactly what purpose, I always come back to what's the Simon Sinek, it's our why and mission, sparking our vision, mission, and values. But I love when you say, what are you fighting for? That's Pretty cool. So do you find that a much more accessible concept?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that I use it when working with an organization is that if I pull random people and I ask them with no translation, no explanation, no nothing, and I say, hey, you know what, as an organization, what are we fighting for? If they can give me an answer to that question, they might have never thought about their corporate purpose as a fight before. But if I ask that question and they go, hey, you know what, we're fighting for this, then I've got an organization. I'm working with an organization that has a clear sense of purpose. I'll give you an example to make it a little, put some bones on this. So on my phone, I have this really cool, this is actually, I'm friends with the founder, but this is a company that I absolutely love now named Pila. They make cell phone cases. They're not made out of plastics made from oil like most cell phone cases, and they're not even made from recycled materials. They're made from farming byproduct from corn husk and soy husk and a bunch of stuff I don't understand, but they're made in such a way that they're biodegradable. If you compost them, they will biodegrade in 10 years. And so when you ask somebody at Pila, what are you fighting for? What they tell you to a T, they tell you we're fighting for a waste-free future. We recognize we're not going to change consumerism, but we can change what gets consumed. And everything flows through that idea of we're fighting for a waste-free future. So for example, when they were looking to expand and create a second product, they didn't do what most companies would do and go, oh, we make cell phone cases, so let's flip and make iPad cases or laptop cases. They went to sunglasses because sunglasses were the next most consumable thing made of plastic, right? And little by little, they make their product decisions based on that idea. What are we fighting for? We're fighting for a waste-free future. So what items are contributing to that waste, and how can we replace them with our biodegradable ones?
That's cool. What a wonderful concept, and it's so tangible. So I'm going to put you on the spot again because I know you do this in more of the course of your work. Do you work with a group and run them through an assessment or a questionnaire to find out what their core values are as it related to, quote, picking a fight?
Yeah. So what I find is that most there's basically, it falls into two different categories, right? A very small percentage of organizations don't have an existing mission, purpose, core values, right? Like that's what I mean when I say we've known about it for 20 years. We're just not moving the needle on it. So they have one. The problem is it's bogged down in jargon, something, shareholder values, innovation, all of these different things. And the meaning piece is, my friend Clay calls it's the glass plaque problem. We got the mission statement, we engraved it on a glass plaque, we put it in the lobby and everybody walks right by it and nobody remembers it, right? Yeah. So a lot of what my work,
it's on the wall.
Right. So a lot of what my work is dealing with those organizations. That's 97, 98% of it, right? So a very small percentage don't have it, and we have things we can do there, but most of it is helping them find a way to do it. I mean, really, there's three templates that we use of fights. And so my role is really to help tease out which fight we're in based on what the existing founding story or mission or purpose is, right? And I call them the revolutionary fight, the underdog fight, or the ally fight. So the revolutionary fight is like Pila case, right? There is something in the industry that is the norm, the status quo, and we find it wrong, we find it unjust, we find it's going to ruin the environment if we let it keep going, right? We're looking to change something. The revolutionary fight is the industry says this is acceptable and we refuse to accept that, and that's our purpose, right? Yeah. Now the underdog fight, I mean, it sounds like what it is, but it's not just about being the small guy. It's about being the person or the company that people don't appreciate, being the one that's been on the receiving end of harsh criticism, and we're going to prove the industry wrong, right? So this is like a Netflix and Blockbuster thing. It wasn't so much about size; it was about how Blockbuster represented this old model, and they were discounting us. They had the chance to buy Netflix at one point and chose not to, right? Which created an underdog narrative. We're going to prove them wrong. I was born in Philadelphia, right? So I'm a big fan of Rocky. I mean, Philadelphia, our greatest sports hero is a fictional character who loses a boxing match, right? Yeah. Well, if you remember in Rocky 1, he loses the match, but he doesn't. It's not about winning the match. It's about going the distance. It's about proving the critics wrong, proving that he's not a bum. And if he goes the distance, even if he loses, he'll do something nobody's ever done. And so he does that, right? So that's the underdog fight. And then the last one is the ally fight, which is quite simply, it's not about us at all. It's about them and what they're fighting for and how we help them. And the good news is you get to define them however you want. That can be a customer, it can be a stakeholder, it can be something else, but it's not about us, it's about them. And our job in the organization is to help them win that fight.
Yeah. It's a wonderful concept, and I love the idea of broaching it from a statement that certainly catches attention. Pick a fight. So, and
Yeah,
that's
it is a deliberately provocative title. I will admit that, but it's a double meaning, right? So it's not about picking a fight with competitors.
right.
Leaders need to choose their fight wisely, right? So you pick of those three which one exists in our current mission statement. So it's not enough to just pick a fight. You have to choose one wisely as well.
The way you frame it, it is aspirational, which is what this is all about. So that's great. So what about some from your newest book is on anywhere from lead. Tell us about secrets to leading when you're not physically present.
Yeah, the biggest thing I think that we're seeing even now, right? We're 6 months in, but we were seeing this in the research before. The biggest challenge for a lot of leaders, team leaders that are fully remote right now, and then might move into that hybrid, that working from anywhere environment is going to be cultivating two things, really. Cultivating a sense of shared understanding, meaning that I understand the context that everybody is working in. I understand we have clear expectations about how people are working, what their levels of responsiveness are. We all agreed not to send late night emails, or we all agreed that we all send late night emails, whatever it is. So we have that sense of shared understanding, and then we have that sense of shared identity. And this is actually, again, where that pick a fight piece comes in, because purpose creates a sense of that identity. But that's going to be a big struggle. It already sort of is. Combating loneliness in a remote work environment, combating the idea. But when we move to a hybrid, we're going to start seeing a lot more of an us versus them, us being the co-located people, them being the out there people. And so the big struggle for leaders is creating that sense of shared identity.
That's what I was wondering about as far as I hadn't thought it in terms of friction, but of course it would. And here's the way I was framing it. Proximity to power also is a way to get noticed. It's a way to get promoted. So what happens if I'm working virtually or remotely? So.
Right. No, so I totally agree. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier with focusing on outcomes and not activity. But, it's not just the power thing. It's also individually, right? So there's been a ton of, in the world of academics, for example, there have been a ton of different studies that show proximity to each other. It makes for collaboration in future papers, right? So if you have a department that's big enough to be on multiple floors, you'll find the people who are on the same floor collaborate and co-publish papers more often than people who are not, right? So it manifests in little things like that too, even just in the way you ask for help, right? If you're all in a co-located office, it's actually really easy to walk a couple steps down, pop into that other person's cubicle and say, hey, can you explain this function in Excel to me, right? Nobody wants to send an email doing that, right? Or very few people do. And so this is where I think leadership plays a big role in checking in with your people enough to know what their big struggles are, and checking in with them enough to know what their knowledge, skills, and abilities and where their strengths really are, so that you can make those matches, right? So that you can know who's struggling in something, and also who on your team or who elsewhere in the organization you can partner that person with to help them. These are things that used to happen organically and created that sense of team that don't really happen in this environment, or at least don't happen enough, because they require some deliberate action.
Right. I think I want to drill on something a little bit. And forever, businesses are, there's always been competition between headquarters and the field, whatever the field is. Are we going to see that in a hybrid workplace? And I think you alluded to that, a competition or more privileged status, if I will, if I'm in a location versus working apart from it.
Yeah. So, I mean, candidly, I think this depends on the organization and how much work they've done reframing presence and productivity. So I don't want to make a prediction about what we're going to see. I can make a prediction about what good organizations are going to do, right? Yeah. Which is sort of smash that expectation that presence equals productivity. And hence that, I think we're going to see a decrease in the size of offices. I think we're going to see the design of offices shift to like, Basecamp, which was a fully distributed company even before COVID, had a Chicago office that they called library rules. In other words, there were places to work, but the expectation is that we work like you'd be at a library. So we're quiet. If you're here, it's because you need a space to work. And then there are meeting rooms for you to collaborate in person, right? But I think, some of these perks that we used to use to bribe people to stay at the office all the time, the free food, the beer pong, the whatever, like the stuff that we thought made for culture, but never actually made for good culture anyway, Those things are, I think, going to go away because we're going to have to find ways to cater to everybody. And if we do that, then we send a message that that presence piece isn't necessarily required. The other thing I think is going to be really interesting. I mean, I dream of a world where movies like Office Space and TV shows like The Office aren't funny anymore because nobody understands them, right?
Yeah.
To where when there's nothing to do, you don't just get bored and put somebody else's stapler in a thing of Jello. There's nothing to do. Go home, right? You got your work done, so you don't need to be here.
All right. I have a favorite story about The Office, which is Ricky Gervais, as you know, created the series in the UK and then sold the rights to the US. And he had some meetings with Steve Carell about Michael Scott, the title character. And he said something, and I've used it in a couple of different articles. He said, if you don't know Michael Scott, you are Michael Scott. So it's that cluelessness, that's lack of self-awareness. And so I'm a little bit of side story, but I wanted to drill down on this thing about, and you alluded to it when you talk about the academic model, people on the same floor, collaborate and with papers and stuff. There is call it kismet, call it serendipity, the water cool culture. You know, I walk past you in the hall and we have chats and maybe we talk about kids or whatever, but you know, maybe you're working on something and I'm working on something. So we collaborate, but because we've had that physical presence.
Yeah.
How can we foster that in a virtual environment, David?
Yeah. So there's a couple things we can do now, and then there's what I think we'll do long term. So let me answer in twos. The first is I think leaders can go a long way in just creating those sort of micro moments for people to interact, right? So the one company I profiled in the book does this regular tradition they call fika, which is a Swedish word for to have coffee, right? It's a big sort of social thing. And the interesting thing about fika, like we in the United States would call it going for drinks, right? It's not necessarily work, but you do it with your colleagues. But there it can happen in the middle of the day and it's not seen as pulling back from work, right? So they do the same thing, but virtually. They pair people off, you opt into it, then you get randomized with somebody on the team. You just schedule a 30-minute video call, and the expectation is you talk about non-work. You can even send them questions ahead of time, but the idea is we're having some deliberate social time between two people on the team, especially people who don't interact all that much. Okay. Other companies will do things like shared meals. There's a company in the book I profile that does every first Thursday of the month, they do Taco Tuesday. It's a bit of an inside joke because they had to reschedule it the first time. So it's a joke that Taco Tuesday happens on Thursday, but it just creates a time for everybody to come together. So those sort of deliberate actions, you can even, one of the things I did when I was writing the book was what I called work sprints, which is I had a couple other writer friends and we would sign on to Zoom for an hour and we would write for 50 minutes of that hour. And then we'd have little chit chats when we needed breaks, right? So little things like that in the short term. In the long term, I think we're still going to see gatherings as the driver of these serendipities. The office is still going to be a place for meetings and collaboration. I think the money that smart companies are going to take the money that they save on office space because they've reduced the size of it and spend that on offsites that bring everybody together, or even giving managers a budget to bring their people together for a short period of time and get people in physical presence again. Obviously, when it's safe to do so. Right. But that's where I think we're going to see that serendipity happen. It's going to be in that kind of compressed time that we can afford to do now because we're not spending so much on logistics and all of that. And I think the other thing that'll be interesting is people will enjoy their commute to work again, because if you're only ever there once every 2 weeks and it's the time you get to see all your friends, that hour and a half long ride into the city is a whole other experience than if I do this every single day.
Right. And I think there's a subtext to what you're saying. And because even the way you said it about the Swedish example of pairing people off or having social hours and whatever, it's planful, it's planned. And so, you know, and that's, but it's a way of stimulating, I suppose, in a way. So, yeah. David, we're coming to the end of this episode. So I always ask our guests, do you have a lesson of grace that you wish to share with us?
So I would say I owe my career to grace, to be honest with you. So but not a lot of people know this. Before I worked in before I was an author, professor, all of that sort of stuff. Before I went back to grad school, I worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I worked there until 2008, 2009. Certain laws were passed that, for or against, I don't actually care, but they changed the pharma industry a lot.
Yeah.
And I saw the need to sort of get out of this and pivot to what I always wanted to do in retirement. And in order to do that, I spent a lot of work writing letters to literary agents, speakers bureaus, all of these sort of people. And to this day, I remember the only rejection I didn't get was from the literary agent I still have now. And his philosophy was basically, well, you have no platform, you're pivoting to all of this sort of stuff, but I've seen your writing on a couple of these sites and I think it's good. So we'll figure this out together. And we collaboratively built a proposal and did all of that sort of stuff. And from this industry, most people only really want to represent you when you're already hot. So the idea that somebody who is a total unknown would get anybody to take a risk on them, right, was fascinating. And so I still work with him to this day. I love interact with him. I'm fiercely loyal on the people that make bets on me and give me some amount of grace to go, if you sent this many letters out to this many people, you're obviously serious. So let's figure out what we can do together.
What a wonderful story. And that is grace. It's generosity. And your agent showed respect and he acted on your behalf. So, gosh, that's special. David, you've been a great guest. Oh, how can people find you?
So I'm really, really lucky. I mean, if you're watching this on LinkedIn Live, I'll type in a comment right when we get off this. But if you type David Burkus, Burkus into Google, I'm really the only one, which has been really, really lucky for me. So that's another instance of grace in my life. It's Google grace, right? So just, search there. You'll find my website, other stuff to keep the conversation going. And I truly hope we keep this conversation going even after this, because the interesting thing about the future of work is that it's always arriving and there's always more to discuss about it.
Indeed it is. David, you're a terrific guest. Thank you. And with that, we're going to close it out.